today, the First Lady, and she's expressed a desire to sing our song. So, here's how we do it. I hope Gary hasn't forgotten the tune. I hope you haven't forgotten the words. I hope I haven't forgotten the words. And I hope you haven't forgotten the words. One, two, three. Take me out to the moon. Me out to the moon. Buy me some.
The Monday Morning Quarterback on the 15th of October 2018, beaming to you from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. As we normally do on the Monday Morning Quarterback, we dedicate the program to the late Jerry Pippin, who died in 2015, and we broadcast from the Jerry Pippin broadcast booth. Nonetheless, we'll start this off here with the storm in Panama City, Florida. That has been raging for a very, very long time. We started out here with some of the devastation from Hurricane Michael there, catastrophic damage. An Air Force base suffered catastrophic damage, virtually obliterated an entire oceanfront communities in Florida's panhandle, is one thing, just like a bomb drop. That's from Clyde Kane, who was with the Louisiana Cajun Navy, a group of volunteers search and rescues that went to Florida to help out in wake of Michael, just as they did last month during Hurricane Florence in the Carolinas. Michael was downgraded to a tropical storm on Thursday. Let me get the date. This is on Thursday, the 11th of October. Tiny Mexico Beach, a town of about 1,000, appeared to have been almost completely destroyed by Michael and 155 mile an hour winds. This was a community in the middle of the forest. Now the forest is gone, and so is the community. A member of the community said, "This is Party Time USA now. It's devastated town USA." So it went from being, as they say, the life of the party to not having any life at all. Here in Springfield, nearby Panama City, we'll get to that in a minute. Apartment buildings are roofless. Service stations awnings are twisted beyond recognition. Business collapsed. Metal posts as thick as tree trunks were folded in half. Billboards were blown into houses or crushed cars. So some of the things that happened here, it happened in Panama, just west of here, Panama City Beach, a resort area popular with retirees and spring breakers, also was nearly wiped out. So just catastrophic damage down there. Michael also plummeted Tidal Air Force Base and set directly on the shoreline between Panama Beach and Mexico Beach, causing widespread roof damage there. The base's 600 families were evacuated on Monday. Many were taken to shelters to ride out the storm. There were no injuries reported there. And let me finish this part of the story up, because this is an older story. So we'll finish it up. St. George's Island, 75 miles southeast of Panama City. A couple there, Nick Cabarra and his wife, rode out the storm with their 8 children from 2 to 6. So that is that part of it. Let me pick up some more of this as we move along here. This is the Northwest Florida Daily, 4 days after the storm. Large swaths of the Panhandle are suffering. This is from the Associated Press and under the Creative Commons license with this particular newspaper. Crews with backhoes and other heavy equipment scooped up splintered boards, broken glass, chunks of asphalt and other debris, and that hurricane flattened Mexico Beach. That was on a Sunday, as the mayor held out hope that the 250 or so residents who may have tried to ride out the storm. The death toll from Michael devastation marched across Florida to Virginia at 17 people so far. And let's see what else they have. 4 days after the storm struck a large swath of the Panhandle, was suffering from the little beach towns to larger Panama City. We'll get to that in a minute. To rural communities miles from where the hurricane came ashore. More than 190 homes, 90,000 homes and businesses in Florida were without electricity, and 120,000 in Georgia. Marco Vegas Rubio, he was on Meet the Press. There's a lot of island areas. Some of these are poor rural areas to the north of there. These counties that took a devastating hit. In downtown Marianne, Florida, the historic buildings are laid in pieces on the ground across from the county jail. We're trying to help some other people who may not be able to get out of their driveways for a couple of days. That's a person there. As some of the victims that were stranded by the storm managed to summons relief using logs that spell out help, quite literally. That's desperation. That includes Bay County, which includes Mexico Beach. And you have to remember, some of these people are without any type of even communications. The Air Force base that was heavily damaged, Bill Nelson, he's a senator from Florida. The Florida Democrat members of the Armed Forces Committee said older buildings on the base were demolished. So there's billions of dollars going to have to be used to rebuild various places here. Florida officials evacuated 3,000 inmates from 2 hurricane-damaged prisons, the Gulf Coast Correction Institution and Annex and the Calhoun Correction Institution. They were bad damage to the roof and in the structure there. Let me go on here. This is also from the News Herald in Panama City, Florida. The Gulf Power, is the 24th, that'll be Wednesday, for restoring power to Panama City, Youngstown, Lynn Harbor, Parker, and Callaway. That is their target date there. Panama City, Panama Beach, west on 79 is estimated to be restored by the 14th. That would already be that. I'm not sure if they're restored or not. We'll look for updates here and some other places there. And let's see if we can get a little audio. This is from staff. Just shows basically very short segment there. And as we go on, let's see, what else can we get here? in terms of news on the ground there. This is some updates here, resources updates from Panama City, Panama Beach. This again is from the News Herald. Updates here, let's see. With power slowly returning and to give people time to return home from work, the city of Panama Beach has modified its curfew. There was evidently a curfew going on. The curfew was from 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. Shows a pontoon boat here. And I guess that's all we basically had. Showing people here cooking hot dogs around here. And we'll put this on the Twitter feed as from Panama Beach. And on Facebook also. This is a lot of devastation going on here. And people in some of the quote-unquote poor areas were getting the same type of treatment that people got in Puerto Rico. Verizon Wireless had set up 2 wireless emergency communication centers, one at so-and-so street. Both are open from 10 a.m. to 5. The sites have self-service, and people can also charge their electronics. Winn-Dixie, with a mobile pharmacy set up there in Panama City, a notorious anti-union grocery in that area. On a state of emergency, if your current pharmacy is still closed, the mobile prescription is able to refill scripts without transferring. New sites for water have been established also in the area there at various places. A citizen information line has been established for non-emergency calls. Please call 211. That's for questions about food and water distribution. FEMA applications, very important there. You can also text just simply Michael 898-212. As we go down this list of various places that are open, we won't name those because Airburb has activated their emergency response protocol, and numerous houses and rentals are now available free for people of Bay County. That is the company that you can rent places from. That's very interesting to know. Again, that is in Panama City. And Airbob, I guess, Burb, A-I-R-B-U-B. Anyway, they have an emergency network. Some things it did not have. On the Florida Law, Bay County parents can now receive emergency 30-day refills of prescriptions, even if they have just refilled them. So, very helpful there. And it sort of just goes on. AT&T in Panama City will be open tomorrow. I'm supposed it's open now. So things are opening back up. The city has placed a portal potty at various locations. Anyway, definitely needed. And gradually things are... Winn-Dixie has free water as long as the supplies last. Well, that's good to know. And FEMA disaster aid is now available to those in Bay County, that is Panama City. What you will need is your Social Security number, address of your damaged house or apartment, description of damage. That's kind of unnecessary. They know what that is. Information about insurance coverage, a telephone number, a mailing address, if I guess the place is there, bank account, and a routing number if you have that. And, of course, you need a canceled check to do that. The Florida State University, Panama City, is closed until further notice. Panama City Beach open stores there. Some are open. And it mentions them, the Winn-Dixie, the Tom Thumb, and etc., and gives addresses there. The Waffle House is open. Evidently that chain virtually never closes their outdoors during these types of storms. They are used to these storms in that area. So this is some of the stuff we have here. Mobile kitchens from the Salvation Army are out and about also. So let me just check the News Herald here once more and see if there is, I guess we probably got the updates here. We did, in fact, get those out here. So we'll move on now. Let me see where we're moving. We had another story here that... and sometimes these stories slip away from you. We'll go to Reuters very quickly here, and then we'll head back into what we normally do. Sears, the great department store, retail chain, I guess they call it now, filed for Chapter 11. On Monday today, it's 142, close to 142 more stores, thrown into doubt the future of the century-year-old retailer. To reorganize its debt of the parent Sears Roebuck and Company and Kmart Corp following a decade of revenue decline. So they had been, the company lists assets at $6.9 billion and liabilities at $13.3 billion. That's in documents filed in the Southern District of New York. That's where they filed their bankruptcy. And they list as Toys R Us. They did emerge, Toys R Us, that is, and they had to liquidate. So everything is in doubt here. Their shares are now worth 41 cents. I'd hate to be a former worker there. And down from $100 the year after the hedge fund Star once hailed as another Lamper, as another Warren Buffett. Well, maybe he was, but they merged an $11 million deal that was in 2005, 10 years ago. That is basically the Sears story. They are out of the game. 1,000 more workers will be made redundant. We see a lot of these redundancies coming out here. Rail services are being reconnected between the north and south of the Koreas, so that will be moving on. And Honduran immigrants are heading for the U.S. It's grown, not very many, 1,500 here. Honduran, immigrants headed for the U.S., moving towards the Guatemalan border. Guatemala, big picture of them moving through. The immigrants, including families, children, etc., on the move, as one would say. And that is just a fact of life. Let me move on here. From Tammy Baldwin, she's a senator from Wisconsin. She filed what's called a discharge petition to force the Senate to vote on overhauling Trump's administration's expansion of junk insurance plans. The Senate will vote this week on junk insurance plans that could deny coverage for pre-existing conditions, with 44 senators supporting the resolution. 2 Republican votes are needed to pass it in the Senate. They evidently ended up at 50-50. This is on the 9th here, discharge a petition that she filed. And the Trump administration is rewriting the rules for guaranteed health care protection that millions of Americans depend on. These junk plans could deny coverage to people with pre-existing conditions and don't have to provide essential medical services like prescription drugs, emergency room visits, maternity care. Anyone who says they support health care coverage excuse me, and this is the number one issue in the 2018 midterm election, the opportunity of Democrats and Republicans to protect the people. Effort is co-sponsored by more than 20 of the nation's top healthcare organizations. The American Cancer Society, Cancer Action Network, the American Heart Association, Planned Parenthood, Federation of America, Pro-Choice of America, the Cystic Fibrosis Society, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, the National Women's Law Center, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Academy of Family Physicians, the American Academy of Podiatrists, the American College of Physicians, the American Osteopathic Association, Psychiatric Association here, and Families USA are just some of those mental health associates and various lobbies. The discharge petition is available here. I believe we already presented this information up here, and those that have sponsored it, we can see their names on the petition. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with Chapter 8, Title 5 of the U.S. Code, hereby direct that the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Welfare, and Pensions discharge for further consideration SJR 63. And the names are here. Bill Nelson, we see them all that have signed this. Just some of those here. These are senators, incidentally. See Elizabeth Warren's name here, Amy Klobuchar, and various others. Tom Capers, Joe Donnelly, and various others that have signed Tammy's petition. Anyway, you know that in these pre-existing conditions here, very important on health care coverage. All right. Well, I'll get back to this. This involves Wikipedia and why the Nobel Prize winner, Donna Strickland, doesn't have a Wikipedia page. This is crass discrimination, no doubt about that. On October 2nd, when Ms. Strickland won a Nobel Prize in Physics, the committee recognized her work on methods of generating laser beams with ultrasound pulse. She's only the third woman in history to do so. That day, she finally got a Wikipedia page of her own. The long delay was not for lack of trying. Last May, an editor had rejected the submitted entry on Strickland, saying that the subject did not merit Wikipedia's nobility requirement. Strickland's biography, went up shortly after her award was announced. If you click on History tab to view the page edits, you can replay the process of a woman scientist finally gaining widespread recognition. A biology professor who edits Wikipedia's Strickland story did not surprise me. According to Wikipedia Foundation, as of 2016, only 17% of the reference project biographies were about women. What more, I see that the underlying dynamics of this gender gap plays out in my undergraduate courses. This is the woman written out. This is the Washington Post, incidentally. In 2014, I developed assignments requiring students to edit Wikipedia. One had them choose a woman scientist or an ecologist of any gender, and I would start a Wikipedia page or add to their biography I've added before. This was partly due to lure students into learning HTML style coding. That's not hard to do. And also so they could home in on important transfer skills. As a new Wikipedia editor, you learn to follow style rules and policies. You learn how to put work into the public domain while still guarding your intellectual property. open access internet resources here. And let me just get her name. So this is Dawn Breesley. She is a university professor of biology at York University in Toronto, Canada. All right, we'll kind of move on with this assignment here. Wikipedia has its own internal challenges. Despite the efforts of the Wikipedia Foundation, its community remains stubbornly predominantly male. A survey suggests only 9 to 6% of the contributors are women. Wikipedia's technical jargon and oblique rules of conduct intimidate newcomers and do so for more experienced editors who jockey for status through edits and in talk sections where they discuss. A 2011 study from the University of Minnesota found that new female editors are much more likely to have their edits reversed and are much more likely to be indefinitely blocked. It's a little surprising that in a 1 year span, only 9% of changes made by new editors were made by women, and only 6% of the contributors of more than 500 edits were women. Academics have observed what we call a men's movement cyber vigilante patrolling sites for reference to women. And this is very important to know. I did not know this was happening at Wikipedia. A few days ago, I learned that someone had made a Wikipedia page for me, though it was a nice surprise for me. I understand how long an entry is about reinforcing the subject's ego. I am an ecologist specializing in plants, so when I grow up, when I was growing up, the only women scientist I could name was Muriel Curry, and only because biology, because after becoming, a biology teacher, I did learn about botanists and Carrie Derrick. She is a genealogist, a genealogist, who in 1912 became the first woman to hold a university professorship in Canada. And later, while doing archival research on my sabbatical, I did find about hidden figures who contributed to the field before hers. In the 19th century, women who collected specimens, ran successful gardening businesses, illustrated plant guides, etc. And someone who was born in India and immigrated to central London and after suburban Canada. So some of the things going on here. Science should always be everyone's, be for everyone and accountable to everyone, and should go all out to welcome common knowledge. Wikipedia offers us the opportunity to question our preconceived notions of who is worth knowing about. It's a very good article here. I think I will pinch it as a show note, and the reason for this, it's a very important article within itself. And I'll come back to that. Now, to the Pew Center, and this is a survey. I just want to check out time here. We're rolling okay. We have, incidentally, an edited version of a panel discussion at Face the Nation. Various people were there, including Ms. Page. She's from USA Today. So she was there, and a person, I believe, from the Atlantic magazine were also there. Let me get this in. How social media users have discussed sexual harassment since Me Too went virtual. Me Too hashtag first went virtual on Twitter a year ago this month. So that would have been back in October 2017. although the social movement of the same name existed beforehand, and the hashtag was popularized on the 15th of October. The Me Too hashtag has been used by more than 19 million times on Twitter. That's a lot of times. The data from Milano's initial, that's an actress named Milano, initial tweet on September the 30th of this year. That's according to the Pew Center. Analysis of publicly available English language tweets. That works out to be an average of 55,319 uses of the hashtag. The day with a single great number of mention there of the former chairman of CBS, Leslie Mouvos. Hope I pronounced his name correctly. He's gone, fortunately, for the humanity. Personal stories and prominent celebrities have been key topics in Me Too. The Center conducted a separate analysis of 5 time periods with high volume, this is English language, Me Too tweets, to examine how often these specific topics were mentioned in connection with the hashtag. The topics were Twitter users shared personal stories of harassment, and users talked about the entertainment industry or celebrities in tweets. Users discussed national politics or politicians. 15% of tweets across these specific time periods mentioned celebrities or entertainment industry more broadly, while 14% referred to personal stories or narratives. A small share of these, 7%, mentioned politics or specific politicians. The high volume time period in this analysis did not necessarily correspond with the above. Well, you don't see the graphic. I'll have to put this on. The majority of Me Too tweets in high volume periods have been in English, but interests have spanned multiple languages. Roughly 7 in 10 Me Too tweets, that's 71%, were over these so-called high usage time periods were written in English, but the movement has spiked social media interests across the globe. 29% of Me Too tweets during the period were written in another language, with Afrikaans at 7% of the total, Somalis at 4%, Spanish, I'm surprised so low, 3%, and making up the largest share of non-English tweets. It's common for social media users in the U.S. to see content about sexual harassment or assault. Roughly 2/3, 65% of U.S. adults who use social media say that at least some of their content they have seen these platforms pertaining to sexual harassment or assault. Includes 29% who say the great deal of what they see on social media is focused on the issue, and according to a release of data from the Pew survey conducted a year earlier, it's common for social media users from various demographic groups to encounter these types of posts. For example, men are more likely as women to report seeing at least some content related to sexual harassment or assaults. They didn't explore the Kavanaugh. The immediate aftermath of prominent sexual harassment allegations in 2017, some members of Congress addressed the issue on their official Facebook pages. More than 4 in 10 members of Congress, that's 44%, mentioned sexual misconduct at least one point on their official Facebook accounts in October the 1st through December 30th. This is of 2017, very important to remember there. And let me see if we'll get this. Harvard, does Harvard discriminate against Asians in a case that could, this is from the Los Angeles Times, up in college admissions. The Ivy League trial goes on trial. These are Harrison Chin and Fong Depew. graduated DIEP, graduated number one from high schools. Both had extracurricular activities, something that they asked. Chen was raised by middle-class Chinese immigrants outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, and was rejected by Harvard University. DP, a Vietnamese immigrant who grew up in a working-class family in Racina, got in. The experience have left them with distinct feelings about affirmative action in a federal lawsuit against Harvard that put Asian Americans at the center of one of the most contentious issues in higher education. Chen opposes the consideration of race in college admissions and plans to join like-minded Asian Americans in a rally on a Sunday. I guess it's already occurred, a day before Harvard is scheduled to go on trial. People should judge you on character. That is a bunch of hooey. And Merritt, 18-year-old freshman, and his backup Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee. DP, who favors affirmative action plans, attend a rally a few miles away at Harvard Square. Removing race would advance us to be more just and equal society, so-called DP says. He's 21 years old, senior at Harvard. But the Harvard case, Asian Americans argue that race consideration has made them a victim of their own academic success. They tend to get better grades and score higher on standardized tests than other races, but claim they are frequently rejected as a result of racial balancing. Well, that's a very interesting situation for numbers of people. First of all, if Harvard University became 50% Asian, they would defeat their mission as an education institution. That's just that simple. Being Asian actually decreases the chance of admission. The lawsuit says, citing a Duke University economist analysis 6 years ago, that was flawed. It claimed that Asian people, that American Asian applicants have a 25% chance of getting in, would have a 35% chance if they were white, or dramatically better odds if they were African American or Latino. And that is just a farce to have that out. We looked at that once before, and it was definitely flawed. Not unusual. In response to Harvard, the said studies of admission, including its own internal review, has been either inconclusive or flawed. The data use doesn't include essential application factors such as personal essays, and that's one of the big things that's always happened. Personal essays. A UC Berkeley economist who analyzed Harvard's admission data found no negative effects on American Asian ethnicity. For every application, the university considers the whole person, including consideration of racial and non-racial factors such as socioeconomic background, to grades, test scores, recommendations, extracurricular activities, personal qualities. There are interviews involved here, such as being kind, respectable, likable. An approach Harvard said is well within the law. And also if their parents are alumni of Harvard University and various other universities, they tend to get a leg up on admissions. If a lawsuit against Harvard succeeds, it would diminish students' opportunities to live and learn in a diverse campus environment. And that in itself causes immediate problems, because since the world itself is much more globalized, the economy leading the way, no doubt, and the world itself is getting much more globalized. This is one reason where nationalism itself is a big pitfall. It actually is. And one long-time hyena here, Students for Fair Admission. This is Edward Bloom, a long-time former affirmative action who is a European. He ran in 1992 run for Congress as a Republican in Houston and lost, claiming that his district was gerrymandered to guarantee the seat to a minority. He sued Texas and won at the Supreme Court. Bloom was a significant player in the 2013 Supreme Court case that struck down key portions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a decision that civil rights groups say increased voting restrictions and voting identification laws that disproportionately affect racial minorities in several states. And he helped a European woman sue the University of Texas at Austin over admission policies in the most recent affirmative action case to reach the Supreme Court, which in 2016 ruled in favor of the University of Texas at Austin. Harvard labels this Bloom character an anti-race conscious admission activist, and one Asian American civil rights group supporting the university case said the lawsuit is a thinly veiled attempt to use Asian Americans to destroy racial diversity on every campus across the country. No doubt. The timing could not be better for affirmative action opponents. With Anthony Kennedy now gone, he wrote a 4-3 majority opinion in the Texas case, and now you have Kavanaugh there, and no doubt he will decide it in the case of the anti-affirmative action types. In a statement, the administration's support of the Harvard suit, the Attorney General Beauregard Sessions and departments stepped in to protect the civil rights of what they call of the American people, which is a crock. The majority of Americans say merit alone should determine who is admitted to college, according to Gallup, and at the same time surveys from the Pew Center show that a majority of support programs to increase diversity. Well, the problem here is that if you don't admit people of color to these various colleges, they would simply not be there. But open education is challenging that things like Wikipedia, these online courses, etc., where people will be able to take those and still get a university degree. The whole thing of education itself is changing. Harvard offers some online programs also, and other universities will go to that. If there's a program to support minorities in competing and advancing their prospects in higher education, big majorities will be behind it. That is from Laura Stoker, a political scientist at UC Berkeley. When it comes to fiddling with selection criteria, the public support dwindles. That's because affirmative action can so easily be portrayed as a form of unwanted discrimination. Over 65% of Asian Americans support affirmative action, according to AAPI data, which conducts policy research on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. But among Chinese Americans, the largest Asian group in the country, support for race preferences fell from 78% in 2012 to 41% in 2016. Support among other Asian groups held at a steady pace. That's kind of interesting with Chinese Americans. An unfortunate situation. What happens here, this pits smaller groups against larger groups there and creates a lot of problems across the society for people, say, from Chinese Americans that would go into certain professions. They would have a stigma there, and that would be long-lasting, particularly as the number, say, of Latinos grow in the country. And if you look, for instance, in terms of demographics, 5 years out in places like Texas, etc., the number of Latinos are growing continuously. In California, the number of Asians are really not growing that much. But now you look at the Chinese as a whole, And China, that is a different situation there, totally different. But you can see where that argument is going, that is placed upon them, and that's deliberately being done to turn these people into pariahs in the eyes of some. And it goes beyond just Latinos and African Americans. It also goes to working class Europeans. DP, who is slated to testify, said in the court filings his let me start this again. SAT score of 2060 was high, although at the lower end at Harvard's average. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at that and see where it is these days. They have changed that over. Chen, who aced 17 advanced placement classes in high school, he holds a no grudge against Harvard and is more offended by what he perceives as patronizing admission policies. Without access to his application, he acknowledged that he cannot be sure that Harvard would have accepted him even if the race consideration was discontinued. He will not testify at the trial, but Students for Fair Admission liked an opinion piece he wrote last year from the Vanderbilt publication. Chen will speak at a rally with members of the group on a Sunday. So that is some of the things going on there at Harvard University. A very unfortunate situation in itself. Let me just move on here. I think we pretty much exhausted this. There was another article we wanted to look at that addressed class in the Michael situation down in Panama Beach, Florida. And the Washington Post here is pretty much full of the same thing. And the Washington Post has Harvard's secretive admission process will get a rare public glimpse. Alleged victims of racial bias remain anonymous. So this is their way of doing it. Here, that the trial will go on. Some Harvard students and alumni, including Asian Americans, expected to testify in support of the race-conscious program. And the public voice of Harvard's forwards this Edward Bloom character, president of Students for Fair Admission. He's 66. He's a European. He lives in Florida and Maine. I guess Florida in the winter, Maine in the summer. Organizing, he was running in Texas. I'm not sure what his particular situation is. That was the Abigail Fisher. Remember old Abigail Fisher? The case became moot. I believe she went to Louisiana State University. A group called Asian American Coalition for Education and others rallied Sunday afternoon in Boston in support of the lawsuit, I bet. Janelle Wong, a professor of Asian American Studies at Maryland, who supports the Harvard policy, my answer is no way. Students for Fair Admission filed its lawsuit against Harvard in 2014, alleging the university limits the number of Asian Americans. They're used as a proxy for a bunch of hyenas. Let me be unequivocal. The college admission process does not discriminate against anyone. That is from the president of Harvard, Lawrence Baikal. I am confident the evidence presented at trial will establish that fact. In the last admission cycle, 42,749 applicants sought to enter the freshman class. The university offers admission to fewer than 2,000. 1,962 fewer than 5%, one of the nation's lowest rates. Of those, 23% were Asian Americans. That's a high percentage, considering Asian American share of the nation population is about 6%, and that's very generous there. The Dean of Admissions will be the first plaintiff. Let's see. And alumni Jim Healy, Senior Deputy Director of Litigation for the fund. That's the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund. Students who testified that one Vietnamese American, one African American, and one biracial student of Mexican and African American descent, also called a Chinese graduate to testify, Lee said. So the NAACP is involved in this, and I think we already discussed that. Let's move on here. Incidentally, the Khashoggi case, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, crisis has strained relations between various institutions in the U.S. and also in Saudi Arabia. The Citibank people were one. They were drawn from a conference in Saudi Arabia. This thing is bigger than one would think. In his first interview with 60 Minutes, this is DJ Trump H was talking about this. Putin is probably involved in assassinations, but it's not in our country. Oh, well. That's from DJ Trump, World of Wisdom there. In Trump's country, Republican candidates this year fall flat. This is an article here by Robert Costa, is one of the people midway through another Records arena rally. DJ Trump offered a revealing aside about Lou Bartell as a Republican recruit to jump into a Pennsylvania race. I got him into this, he said, and musing about what he called the only bad thing about Barletta candidacy before thousands of supporters. In red caps for the rest of his life, he could have been a congressman. Oh, well. Moments later, fleeing dismay about the prospects of Bartella's looming unemployment has passed, but the ripple was telling Post showed Bartella well behind Democratic Senator Senator Casey Ayers. He's been behind him from the very beginning. A number of Republicans running for governor in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania include several who hitched their wagon to Trump, a mistake in itself. Democratic candidates for governors running about even with Republican governors in Des Moines Registry poll this week found Walker trailing his opponent, Tommy Evans. He's in Wisconsin, Secretary of Education there. We haven't seen a lot of polling out of Iowa, period. And let me back to the article here as we finish up. And we'll do sports. We'll do, incidentally, a special programming on the American League and National League Championship Series. They note in the article that then candidate Barack Obama swept the industrial Midwest, or Rust Belt, what do you want to call it, in the 2008 elections. 2 years later, that's when Republicans retook governor's chairs in Ohio, Michigan, Iowa, and Wisconsin, along with Senate seats in Indiana and Wisconsin there. But Indiana has always been Republican. Tammy Baldwin, has been ahead by at least 5 to 10 points over Leifer Vokmeier, I suppose is how you pronounce it. And let me finish this up here. Dismal. Let's see if we can get the... this is the Iowa poll. This may not be actually... Okay. Oops. Healthcare and education is cited as top issues, and that has been cited. This poll is a little bit old here. We won't get into it, but we really won't get into it. It's too far out. We'll check in on the polling very quickly, and we will go to Face the Nation and the panel on Face the Nation as they talk about healthcare, etc. We do have a little bit of polling here. Minnesota's 8th district there. Stuber by 15 points over Ravinovich. I always mispronounce old Joe's name there. In Pennsylvania, 1. Wallace is ahead by 7. Now that is Minnesota 8th. Used to be Nolan's district there in northern Minnesota. And this is a New York Times poll here in double digits. Don't know. See if we have any other polling here at all. Joe Ravinovich. And this Peter, I guess it's called Stuber. Anyway, old Stuber, we just don't have very much here. Leans Republican is the marker here, and Trump got 15 plus points there. We just don't have any polling in that district. See if anything pops up here at 49% and Joe Radovich at 34%. One of the most active districts, 20th century. Democrats are trying to hold on. We made 19,000 calls, and 507 people spoke to us. That tells you what polling is these days. I've been a pollster for a very long time. We used to not ever have that kind of situation, period. Now, this guy is a different individual. I was thinking of somebody else. Rinovich, he's 32 years old. He was a campaign manager. The current representative, Mr. Dolan. This guy, Stuber, S-T-A-U-B, he's out of St. Louis County, and a retired police lieutenant, former college hockey star. Played in with the Detroit Red Wings. Didn't know that. Didn't know really anything about the race. They banded that around for a few times here. But organizations, the Cook Report had it a toss-up. The 538, a likely Republican, and the Center for Politics, a toss-up there. I'm not sure. Oh, okay. 23% of adults have a college education, and 94% of the registered voters are Europeans. The poll, this district, showing a close race. That was in September the 9th, and that has all changed. It's generally best to look at a single poll in context of other polls. That is very true there. But these polls are all back in September, so not very much one can say, about this. People who say they're almost certain to vote, but Stuber, plus 16 types of people who say they're adjusted to the past levels. Anyway, this is on Stuber. So we won't really go into this anymore. We'll have a show on polling, probably more than one show on polling. Let's go to ESPN and we'll get the score from last night, and we'll end our little situation here. There was one game last night, and it was in Boston, and the Red Sox ended up winning the game 7-5. So now the series is tied. The line score was the Astros had 5 runs, 7 hits, and 1 error. The Red Sox had 7 runs, 9 hits, and no errors. The save was Kimball, and Burns was the winner, and Cole was the loser. But Cole pitched a very good game there, and Mr. Price was knocked out in the early innings and left in the early innings, but he pretty much pitched a pretty good game. Now, I don't know if we have the line score up here. Maybe we do. Well, no, this is just the number of wins. Boston won 108 games, 54 losses, and the percentage was .667. David Price turns around postseason narrative in a game.
It does. I mean, Price. You can ask any of my teammates for the 10 years I've been in the big leagues, or coaches, or anybody that's been around me. All I want to do is win. I mean, I expect myself to be great in big moments, and I haven't done that thus far in my career. But I came here to win, period. I came here to win a World Series and to do it multiple times, and that's what I'm about. You know, I put myself aside. You know, this isn't about me. You know, I understand the narratives. I get that. You know, I deserve those narratives, but this is bigger than David Price. This isn't about me. This is about the Boston Red Sox.
Very good there. He left after 4.5 innings, a 5-hit ball there at Fenway
1-0
Park.
Swing and a line drive.
So that was basically the game. There, according to Elliott Sports, where we go? Bureau, this was by far the most consecutive loss for a pitcher's team to start in the postseason in the major leagues. Vita Blue, remember him, and Doyle Alexander's team went winless across every pitcher in the first 6 career post starts, and it is a big deal. Price, Sunday's games, Price team, he had pitched in playoffs with Tampa Bay, Detroit, and Toronto in his 11 years. He said 10 years have gone 0 for 10 in the 10 postseason starts he had. So he finally got on the right side in a game, and he will no doubt be much better off from the Red Sox on Sunday. Price was effective enough after allowing 4 runs in 3.5 innings, settled down for 1, 2, 3, 4th. Price gave up 2 quick outs in the 5th, and then surrendered a pair of walks. And after the second walk, the manager, Alex Cora, sent for Mr. Price. Anyway, this will do it for us. Have a good week, everyone. We'll talk to you soon. Incidentally, we have a Numbers Man presentation. That is our macroeconomics presentation on the Boston Red Network under the Numbers Man franchise. There was also the week that was, and there's some of the debates. We covered the debate in Indiana between Senator Donnelly and Brum. I think his name was Brum. Anyway, and we will cover the California debate. There's only one. That's between Gavin Newsom, and Cox, the transplanted business type down in San Diego. Been out of Illinois. He's been in a lot of places. A builder of apartment buildings, I suppose. Anyway, nonetheless, those are some of the programs we have been covering and looking at debate styles. We also covered a Minnesota gubernatorial race a few days ago between, let's see who is there, in Minnesota. So many of these going on here. I have to try to think back. I don't have my notes with me, unfortunately. Oh, that would be Waltz and Johnson in Minnesota.
Face the nation. The midterm elections are less than a month away.
So we'd like to welcome CBS News Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto to share some new insights from our Battleground Tracker polling. All right, Anthony, let's start with the top big insight. What's going to happen to the House?
Well, at the moment, we've got the House with the Democrats getting over the 218 seats that they would need to take it. If the election were today, right now we've got them at 226 seats in our model. That number has been creeping up slowly over the course of the summer, as long as we've been doing these battleground trackers. But it is still very heavily dependent on at least two things for the Democrats. And I can't emphasize this enough. It's dependent on turnout among people who don't typically vote in midterms, and it's dependent on a few meaningful crossover voters coming from having voted for Donald Trump to voting Democrat now.
Okay, so just to remind people, you're not saying that it is chiseled in stone that Democrats will take the House. You're saying right now, as trends go forward, it looks like the Democrats have a shot. Run me through those two scenarios and how they play out.
Yeah, what we did with this was, because we want to emphasize for people that we're defining a range of possibilities here, especially still weeks out, we actually took the model and we reran it with these scenarios. One, how many seats could the Democrats conceivably get if everything breaks their way? If all of these folks really do show up, if all of these groups that they're dependent on, these younger voters, these women voters, all do stay the way they are in the polling.
And the first group you're talking about are people who don't usually vote in midterm elections.
That's right.
This is the scenario actually they do this time.
Actually, they do. They make good on what they're telling us, on what most of them are telling us in the polling. Now, if we put that in the model, it goes as high as 235 seats, so they get a little bump from that. However, let's suppose they don't show up, and that's a reasonable assumption because they haven't done this before, and frankly, sometimes people do over-report this turnout propensity in the polling, right? So if they don't show up, these are folks who maybe they voted in a presidential, but they didn't typically vote in the last midterms in 2010 and 2014. If they don't show up, then the Democrats don't make it. They don't get the 218 that they need, and the Republicans hold the House. So if they don't get that, and the Democrats don't get quite as many of those crossover voters come back home a little bit to the Republican Party, then the reps still have a chance to hold it.
These people you're talking about are the ones who would like to tell a pollster they're going to vote. They feel it's their civic duty, but Election Day comes around, they're busy, they got a couple of jobs, whatever, they're not making it. So these are the people who are the key to what you've identified, which is maybe that's the key to whether the Democrats take the House or not.
Yeah, and they mean it when they say it now. Yeah. But right, life sometimes gets in the way.
You also measure this question of enthusiasm, but you have a more subtle crack at it. What did you find about enthusiasm?
Well, enthusiasm is one of those factors that's mixed into what you just described. People who really mean to vote, but maybe something gets in the way. Maybe enthusiasm helps you get over that hurdle. But really, I want to say that enthusiasm is not the same thing as voting. What you want to look at is that intent to vote. Look, you can only push that lever so hard. You can push it enthusiastically, or you can just kind of give it a click. It's still one vote. But what you want to look at is whether that enthusiasm then drives people across that finish line, actually gets them there.
So your point is people can get more enthusiastic, so they're snapping the lever off when they pull it, but it doesn't mean that an additional person is going to vote necessarily. Is there a way enthusiasm splits by party?
Yeah. The Republicans have become more enthusiastic over the last couple of weeks. That's important for them, right? They want to get that base turnout, and we think that helps move that. But at the same time, the vote intention of both parties is up, and it is even. It is even between Democrats and Republicans saying that they're showing up.
So they're going to show up at the polls. Both parties are saying as much. Does that represent a change more for the Republicans or the Democrats recently?
Well, the enthusiasm is up, but the Democrats and Republicans are equally up on intention of turning out.
Now, let's go to the groups within the polling. What are you learning and seeing about women and men and the so-called gender gap?
Right. Well, the gender gap is up, and that means there's an increasing difference between how women are voting, in this case more heavily for the Democrats, and how men are voting, in this case more heavily for the Republicans. So we looked at why this is, and one of the reasons is that women are among this group that are heavily cross-pressured this year. They say that they think the economy is doing well. Normally that would advantage the party in power, the Republicans. they voted in these districts. They voted for Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in about even measures. But this year they also say that they're unsatisfied with the direction of the country, and they're breaking Democratic for that reason. They also tell us that they feel like the Republican Party works against the interests of women and more for the interests of men. So on a personal level, as a group identifier, group affiliation, you see them breaking more heavily Democratic right now.
What did we, if anything, learn about what the hearings of Justice Kavanaugh did to affect either women, men, enthusiasm? There were a lot of claims made. What does the data show?
It inserted a lot of anger. We see anger up on both sides. We see Republicans saying they're increasingly angry about the prospect of the Democrats winning, Democrats saying they're increasingly angry about the prospect of the Republicans winning. Now, anger does also correlate with intention to turn out. When you feel more passionate about something, you're more likely to go and do it. So that's one determinant of turnout for certain. Did it change anybody's mind, though? No. It does not appear like it changed anybody's mind. It appeared to just cement what people already thought going in.
Now, we know that the news cycle changes, multiple times a day. What is your expectation? Do you have anything in the data that tells us anything about whether that anger stays and sticks and takes people all the way to Election Day? Or is it an acute, momentary thing happening now?
Well, one factor you want to watch is the president. We are on pace now for the president to be a factor in people's voting at really what would be historic levels. So typically, a majority, maybe a slight majority of people who vote in midterms say that the president's a factor in their vote, either for or against. But this year, we've got many more voters saying that they feel like the president is a factor, either for or against. In fact, it's relatively split. But there's no question that he is on the ballot, so to speak, or at least in the minds of voters when they're going to the polls this year.
He says he wants it to be a referendum on him, and it turns out the voters are seeing it, though.
Very much so. Like I said, at historic levels at this point.
All right. Anthony Salvanto, thank you so much for breaking it all down for us. We'll be seeing a lot of you in the next 20 days.
Indeed. Thanks, John.
And we'll be right back.
I was diagnosed with cervical cancer in 2015. My world had stopped. I thank God I had insurance because
For some political analysis, we'd now like to welcome our panel. Susan Page is the Washington Bureau senior editor of the National Review, and Susan Glasser writes about the presidency and foreign policy for The New Yorker. Susan Glasser, I want to start with you on the question of Jamal Khashoggi. Put all the pieces in order for us of this issue, why it's a challenge for the White House, and what you expect next.
Well, first of all, look, this is a story I think that really has captured the attention of Washington and many capitals around the world because it seems to so directly implicate not just this horrific question of this Saudi dissident journalist who's in self-imposed exile here in the United States, writing column for the Washington Post. He's broken with the leadership of Saudi Arabia, and it appears to be a very personal feud with the young crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. But that's also why it's a Washington story. President Trump, and in particular his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, have made the relationship extremely personal with Saudi Arabia. They've doubled down on America's traditional alliance with the Saudis. Jared Kushner has forged a personal relationship with MBS, as he's known, overriding concerns of many here that, in fact, he was not so much a liberal reformer as someone consolidating power and cracking down on dissidents. So you see this case kind of bringing all those concerns together. And there's a real question, of course, of the judgment of the Trump administration and also the politics.
Right. And Susan, speaking of the politics, the president came right out and said this is about jobs, potentially. He says $110 billion in orders from the Saudi Arabia, which is that's orders to come, not already booked. But and that's really, he said, I wouldn't want to do anything that would endanger that.
But other policymakers may have other views on what price are you willing to put on the life of a U.S. resident who is a dissident journalist who is lured to his country's embassy and then dismembered, we believe. And with the idea that there may be recordings of this, I think escalates this. It's been no surprise to anybody in Washington that Saudi Arabia has a very questionable record when it comes to human rights. But is this a bridge too far when it comes to these contracts? And you saw the discomfort in your interview with Marco Rubio with the way the president had expressed this concern as though these contracts would necessarily override whatever you might want to do to sanction Saudi Arabia if this is indeed is what happened.
Jonah, where do you think this fits in America first? Because the president, in a sense, is saying something that maybe previous presidents wouldn't have said it out loud, but they would put America's interests, multifaceted interests. We should also mention that Saudi Arabia is a great counterweight to Iran for the United States. And maybe he's just saying out loud what previous presidents just wouldn't have said out loud, but there are American jobs to be thought about here, and that this is perfectly in keeping with President Trump's kind of vision of foreign policy.
I think it is perfectly in keeping. And, when he says, I don't want to jeopardize this $110 billion in orders, I wish someone would ask him, okay, so how many journalists does Saudi Arabia get to kill before it might jeopardize it, right? I mean, this is a problem with the rhetoric, and it's also a problem with the relationship. It makes a lot of sense to me, or at least it's perfectly defensible, to have a better relationship with Saudi Arabia, to work this out as a counterweight to Iran. All of those things are fine, or at least defensible. But it has to be, when you get into this situation, it is clear that no one communicated to Saudi Arabia that if we're going to go down this path, you cannot embarrass us or put us in a situation like this. And so now we're at this stage where there are no really very good options. The White House is in a bind on this, and it's because they went down this cul-de-sac to begin with without a proper line of communication. Someone led the Saudi Arabian government to believe that they could get away with this, that this wouldn't be a problem, and that's why it's a mess now. And
Susan, maybe some people are arguing what led the Saudis to believe this is not a lot of scolding on what is happening in Yemen, and that there's a pattern here of basically saying either explicitly or implicitly, we're not going to mess with your sovereignty.
Absolutely. I think this is going to emerge as a case study of why words do matter in the Trump presidency. And Jonah's point is a very important one. What have we seen that's different from President Trump from his predecessors, Democrat and Republican? I would say that it's so much more of a transactional view of America's position in the world. And that is something that's quite different. Certainly, you've had criticism of even Barack Obama for not emphasizing human rights as much as others. But you've never had a president before who called journalists the enemy of the people. Now, if you are the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, do you think you might factor that into your calculation about what you could do with this particular dissident journalist when you have your good friend and ally, the president, say that journalists are enemies of the people? I think it's a really interesting example. Also, values no longer figures in American foreign policy in the way that it has in the past.
Although the president was visited yesterday by Pastor Andrew Brunson, who was released from Turkey based on pressure the president had put. And so the president's supporters are rightly pointing out that were it not for the president, he'd still be in jail.
And the president notes correctly that he has gotten several people who had been held in North Korea and elsewhere, and got them returned to the United States, and that's a fair point. Although the bizarre element of that moment, I thought, was not the prayer, because understandably the pastor would say a prayer of gratitude of being back, but the president then asking him, "Let me ask you, did you vote for me in 2016?" When, of course, he was imprisoned in Turkey.
Well, and it's, again, your supporters. The thing is not that, human rights has become another tool in the partisan arsenal, I think is the big transition there. That's a great example of it.
Right. Jenna, let me switch topics here to a departure from the administration. UN Secretary Nikki Haley is leaving. It was extraordinary this week to see an event at the White House where she said, "I've had a great time," and it was all quite orderly. Mm-hmm. We have not seen all departures from the administration happen in an orderly fashion. What do you make of it?
Yeah, it's great. She wasn't left on a tarmac, for example. Full disclosure, my wife works for Nikki Haley, and so I'm conflicted and biased about this. But I think you can make a persuasive case that she's arguably, first of all, she's probably the most popular politician in America right now. When you think about it, if you look at her poll ratings and among Democrats and independents, also among pro-Trump conservatives and anti-Trump conservatives, she's kind of a unifying figure. And I think her timing in all of this was, either lucky or brilliant. No other person who has worked for the Trump administration has seen their reputation enhanced in the process. And she's getting out while the getting is good by doing it this way. It won't look like she's abandoning a sinking ship if the midterms go south on the Republicans. And I'm looking forward to find out what happens with her next.
Susan Page, what Jonas says is amazing when you think about where Nikki Haley once was in 2016, giving the Republican response to the Democratic president. She talked about angry voices within the Republican Party, which nobody mistook for anything but a shot at Donald Trump. Yet then she goes into the cabinet and goes into the administration and is now leaving, managed pretty nicely. Does this give me your thoughts on that? And then also, let's just give me your thoughts on that.
We obsess about the 2020 Democratic presidential lineup, but if you want to look a little farther down the road for the Republicans, I think you'd have to include Nikki Haley on that list, which is a remarkable thing. For a minority woman to win election as governor in South Carolina and then win re-election and then criticize President Trump as a candidate and then turn around and become one of his most prominent spokespersons on foreign policy shows a remarkable nimbleness and political skill. And she emerges from this, as you say, enhanced. And can you think of another example of someone who has come into the administration, served the president, had the president praise her, and emerge without criticism, really, even from those
and just
who criticize?
Very quickly to pick up on the point that Sue made earlier, she was the one figure in the administration who actually did talk about values and human rights around the world and got away with it in a way that someone else in the administration might not have.
What does that mean then, Susan Glasser, for the foreign policy? Does this tell us anything about the current makeup of the foreign policy team? And then what does it mean going forward?
Well, just a quick thing. I do think nimble is a very charitable word, for somebody who has really, Donald Trump hasn't changed, but many of his critics have changed in how they approach and frame him. She did leave the Oval Office saying that Jared Kushner was a hidden genius in the administration the same week that this Saudi controversy has arisen. And this goes to the point of, what is the administration's foreign policy? Increasingly these days, I think we see a situation where it's less and less true that there's a Trump administration foreign policy and a Trump foreign policy. Since President Trump got rid of Rex Tillerson, his first Secretary of State, got rid of H.R. McMaster, replaced them with Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, both of them come out of certainly much more of a classic, very conservative, very hardline Republican foreign policy establishment. They differ on their own policy positions from President Trump, but he's made it very clear that he doesn't want to have any more public disagreements, and it appears that they have not challenge him as much, even privately, as their predecessors did. Nikki Haley is someone who did speak up repeatedly at various points in time, where she disagreed on Russia, for example, and on other aspects of foreign policy. So I think you're going to see a more Trumpian approach to the United Nations. That's also John Bolton, his very hawkish national security advisor, has made an entire career of UN bashing. They're already talking about downgrading the United Nations portfolio. With the absence of Nikki Haley, it's probably no longer going to be a cabinet-level position.
Right, so a consolidation there. Let's switch to politics. Susan Page, the USA Today ran an op-ed from the president on the question of health care this week that was, take it from there.
So this was the editorial page, ran an op-ed, not the news side. I thought it was good that we gave the president a platform. These are the arguments he's making in rallies and as he campaigns for candidates in the midterms. There was a big furor because it was not a fact check. There wasn't a fact check article that went with it and provided context and information for readers. I thought that was a legitimate criticism. I'm glad that we eventually posted a fact check about it. It does show how inflammatory President Trump is for both sides, and how much he defines this midterm election that we're going to see in just 3 weeks.
Joan, in the old days, if a president had written an op-ed that could have been fact-checked, somebody would have maybe lost a job, or there would have been embarrassment. There is a theory out there now that in this polarized world we're in, that you in fact want to insert some things to get fact checked, so you'll get another news cycle, and that the people you're trying to rile up are going to believe you no matter if there's a mountain of fact checking. And so the second round, in which there is fact checking, actually ends up distributing the message through to a larger audience, and that's then good for you. Do you see that in play here?
It might well be. I actually wrote a column about this on Hillary Clinton coming in very late in the early Kavanaugh controversy about getting something completely wrong that Kavanaugh allegedly said about birth control. And it was very strange that she would jump in after it had already been debunked by all the fact checkers. And I made exactly this argument, is that we sort of live in the republic of trolling now. And it benefits you more to be the subject. In a world of negative polarization, to be attacked by your enemies is a benefit in and of itself, even if the attack is legitimate. And I think it's a sort of spreading model of Trumpism that is infecting a lot of our politics and our media.
And yet, Susan Glasser, we have in our Battleground Tracker poll, when people are asked what issue will affect your vote, what is the most important issue to you in your vote in 2018, healthcare comes in number one, ahead of the economy and ahead of so at 70%, economy 67%, and the Supreme Court at 57%. So the president is at least talking about an issue that people really seem to care about.
Well, that's right. It's interesting that he started to do so. As you know, his major health care initiative failed, essentially, which was the repeal of Obamacare, which was something that President Trump, as well as the Republican Party, for years campaigned upon. It failed by a single vote. Trump is still, interestingly, bashing the late Senator John McCain for his decisive vote on that. He did that in an interview with Fox this week, even because he understands that, they haven't really come up with a convincing answer to it. Interestingly, tax cuts doesn't figure on that list. I did the call it crazy or what you want effort of binge watching all 6 hours and 51 minutes of President Trump's 6 rallies so far. There was another one last night for my column in The New Yorker this week. So that's almost 7 hours of Trump. Interestingly, tax cuts, which was going to be the centerpiece of Republican campaigns, generally came in at about the 51-minute mark to his rallies. These are not
saving the best for last.
Well, that's right. But I think, you mentioned the issues that are top of the list, healthcare, the economy. It's not really an issues campaign if you listen to President Trump. And frankly, if you even listen to voters in your poll, the issue is President Trump. And more than any midterm election that I can remember, this genuinely, for both Republicans and Democrats, is a vote about President Trump, it seems to me.
That's in part by President Trump's design.
Yes.
When President Obama was very unpopular at a midterm, he tried to stay out of the news. When President George W. Bush was unpopular at a midterm, he tried to stay away. President Trump is as unpopular as they were, and he is pushing himself out there in a way we've never seen a president for a midterm election. For a president to spend 4 or 5 days a week doing rallies around the country, it makes it impossible for this election not to be about him.
Just very quickly, I thought one of the interesting data points was that Fox News stopped carrying all of his rallies all the way through, and I'm a Fox News contributor, but it was interesting.
All right, we're going to have to end it there, and we didn't talk about Kanye West. We'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back in 2 weeks. For Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson. I'll see you tomorrow and all this week on CBS This Morning.